This is the fifth of 6 lectures on Abrahamic Scripture. In the previous lectures, we've been looking at the Abrahamic tradition from the book of Genesis up through the Gospels and the Epistles. In this particular lecture, we'll look at the emergence of the Islamic tradition and place it in context. And then in the last of the lectures, in lecture number 6, we'll do an overview of the basic doctrines of the various traditions. Now, again, these lectures are for those who are new to these traditions, or perhaps coming from just one and are don't know the others as well. So this is intended to be basic information to develop cultural and religious literacy. It's not to promote any particular religious tradition, but to develop understanding of the various traditions and what I consider to be basic cultural knowledge that one needs to have to function in the world today. And so today's lecture is going to focus on Islam and the way that the Islamic tradition has, in particular, has interpreted the Abrahamic tradition. Now, in the image that you see here, this is another image from Marc Chagall. Each of these lectures, I've included an image from the painter Chagall, one of my favorite painters who came from a conservative Jewish background, but then became a painter against the inclinations of his community. Because again, remember, in the Orthodox Jewish tradition, as well as in the Islamic tradition, one does not one adheres very carefully to the second commandment or the ban on graven images. And so it was a little irregular for him to become a painter in the way that he did. He's a wonderful painter, however, and one of my favorite painters. And this painting by Chagall is of the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael, who were sent into the desert and cast out of the home of Abraham due to jealousy between Sarah and Hagar, and this question of to whom would the blessing of Abraham go? His oldest son Ishmael, or by Hagar the Egyptian, or his youngest son Isaac through Sarah. And we know from the book of Genesis that Abraham cast out Hagar, and Ishmael gave them a few figs and some water, and then left them in the desert. And the biblical text says by Beersheba. In the Islamic tradition, they come to the well, what becomes the well of Zamzam in Mecca, and there the angel appears. And this is later again, Abraham comes back with Ishmael, and and he builds an altar with Ishmael, and this altar becomes the Kaaba. So these are two of the most important holy sites for Muslims in the Islamic tradition. And so this is a story, again, that appears in the book of Genesis, but it's also central to the teachings of Islam and is assumed in the Quran, and is a beloved story that's told by often in the Islamic tradition. Now, again, the material that I'm drawing from come from F.E. Peters' Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, volumes 1 through 3, particularly volume 1, which lays out the basics that we're exploring here. But if you were to get the other 2 volumes, he goes into greater detail about, in these cases, about some of the doctrines. And again, what Peters does is he takes the essential scripture from each tradition and compares and contrasts it. And that's what we're doing here, again, following Peter's example, comparing and contrasting the different scriptural traditions on figures like Moses and Abraham and Ishmael and so on, and what the various scriptural traditions say about these important figures. But they're all the same figures in each tradition, and very much important to know and understand, where we're at in the world today. So if you can see here, I've put this this is from the Pew Research Center chart that shows us what the world's largest religious denominations are, populations. You can see, and this is in 2015, that 31.2% of the world's population are Christians, 24.1% are Muslims, and then a 0.2% are Jews. So as you can see here from this graph, that well over half the world belongs to one of the Abrahamic traditions. And so this is one of the reasons why it's so important to understand what the basic teachings are of these traditions. It's not, and I'm not, and again, the way that I'm presenting this here, it doesn't really matter who you are, what your beliefs are, whether you're, atheist or whatever. To even be able to read the news today, to understand what's happening in the world, you've got to understand these different traditions. And so that's the kind of knowledge that we're trying to develop here as a matter of basic cultural literacy. Now, of course, it's obviously also important to understand Hinduism and Buddhism and other religions as well. But in this case, we're focusing on the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and they're all interrelated. And so these same figures occur over and over again, but with different interpretations and the different traditions. Now, in this map, you can see where the predominant Muslim populations in the world are. And as you can see, there's a large number of Muslims in northern Africa and in the Middle East, and then into Asia as well, and Indonesia. So this is predominantly where the Muslim populations of the world inhabit. But of course, there are Muslims in the United States, and China, and in Europe, and elsewhere in the world as well. This map here tells us something a bit more about the distribution of the Muslim population along the lines of Sunni and Shiite. And we're going to also be talking about differences between Sunni and Shiite in this lecture, but also in lecture number 6. We'll develop an understanding of those differences as well. And this is an important distinction to know and to understand. What very roughly we could say about 80% of Muslims are Sunni, about 20% are Shiite. So the vast majority of Muslims are Sunni. And within that category of Sunni, there are many other kinds of distinctions and denominations that one could make. Same is true of the Shiite tradition. We want to be careful not to develop too homogeneous of a notion of what it means to be a Muslim, because within these categories, say, of Sunni and Shiite, there's a lot of diversity, a lot of variation. It's not possible to speak monolithically of what it means to be a Muslim. It's very many different Muslim peoples in the world, and the same is true of the Christian tradition as well, that different Muslims interpret the Quran in different ways, just as different groups of Christians interpret the Gospels in different kinds of ways as well, and Jews interpret the Torah in different ways as well, with conservative, Orthodox, and Reformed groups in the Judaic tradition. So we really want to be clear that we're not trying to homogenize here. We're not trying to develop an overly simplistic definition of what it means to be a Muslim, but we are trying to develop a broad picture, again, for those who are coming to this material for the first time and want to learn more about what it means to be a Muslim, what Islam is, as well as Christianity and Judaism. This is a little bit more of a closer map, and you can see there where the Shiite and Sunni populations are. Now, I would suggest to you that, many Americans, for instance, they look at what's going on in the Middle East and they don't understand what the conflicts are about. And part of the reason why they don't is because they don't understand the differences between, say, what it means to be a Sunni and Shiite. And so if you understand these differences, you're going to be able to better understand what's happening in the world today in conflicts that the United States, for instance, is directly involved in. So this is, again, in my view, this is very essential knowledge to have, regardless of whatever your own religious orientation is. This is basic knowledge that one needs to be able to function in the world. And if you have it, then you'll be able to read the news about what's happening in places like Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Yemen and so on, and you'll know what is behind the conflicts that are taking place, and what the possibilities are of resolving these conflicts based on these differences that are very old and very deep. And as we're going to see, the Sunni Shiite distinction goes back to the earliest days of Islam, not long after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, when some of these divisions emerged. So we're gonna explore this in our lecture today. Now, here is modern day Saudi Arabia, and you can see there on the map where some of the main cities are. And the two for us that we're going to really need to know well are Mecca and Medina. These are two of the main cities to know. Mecca, of course, is where we were just talking about, where the well of Zamzam is, and the Kaaba, so the altar built by Abraham and Ishmael, and the black stone that is the place where pilgrims go to in their pilgrimage. And then Medina was a city that had a largely, or at least half Jewish population at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And when the people of Mecca became very angry at him for his teachings, because Mecca at that time was a center of pilgrimage for many different sects and groups. It was polytheism was practiced, and he was preaching that there should only be worship of one God, and this made many people very angry. And so for a time he had to flee to Medina, and he lived among the Jews there, and his followers did, and they got into conflict with the people that lived in Medina as well. But after 2 or 3 decades, Muhammad comes back into Mecca triumphantly and smashes the idols against the statues, religious icons of other traditions, and smashes them against the wall of the Kaaba in Mecca, and returns triumphant. And this is the point at which Islam then, he lives for 3 or 4 more years after that. But after his death, it's just remarkable how rapidly Islam spread throughout the world. It just essentially exploded. It just spread everywhere, and was a very popular religion. And it even spread into places where Christianity had been, like in Egypt, for instance, and in other places where Christianity had spread. And in part because it was the teachings of Muhammad were readily graspable to those populations. I mean, for instance, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is always a kind of a complicated doctrine for people to grasp, and it wasn't particularly a successful doctrine in the context of Africa and the Middle East. For instance, the Monophysite traditions of Egypt and Ethiopia and Syria and so on did not accept the doctrine of the Trinity. And in those places that were not inclined to look favorably upon this doctrine, because it saw the doctrine as compromising the unity of God, Islam, that came along, Muhammad's, the main profession of faith being there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, was seen as attractive to many. And in addition to that, it's important to note that Islam brought in also reforms and rights for women, and so it became many women embraced it as well, because it meant an improvement in their situation. So it was very popular, and it spread very rapidly not long after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And within a couple hundred years or so, then all of the Greek writings of Plato and Aristotle and so on had been translated into Arabic, and it began to spread well beyond the borders of what is today Saudi Arabia. Now, let's take a moment and look at our genealogy. Again, you can see we have Adam to Noah, and then Ibrahim, or Prophet Abraham. And we've been talking thus far about the line that goes from Abraham to Isaac, or Ishak, and then Jacob, or Yaqub, down to Mary and Jesus, the sons of Jacob, who formed the nation of the 12 tribes of Israel, and then Moses, or Musa, in the Islamic tradition. But we've said also that Muhammad traces his lineage to Abraham through the older son of Abraham, Ishmael. And so it's important to note that you have a similar genealogy in Islam, and this is going to be particularly important for the Shiite traditions for reasons we'll discuss, but it's important in the Sunni tradition as well as in the Christian tradition. These And in the Judaic tradition, these established genealogies are central to all three of the Abrahamic traditions. And this is one of the reasons why it's important to know the key figures of these genealogies, because again, they do tend to repeat themselves in the scriptural traditions. But if you can, a lot of times a Christian who's unfamiliar with Islam will come across a name like, let's say, Musa or Isa, have no idea that the text that they're reading about is referring to the prophet Moses and the prophet Jesus. So one needs to also be able to be familiar with the Islamic version or the Arabic version of these names as well, which are same names, but just with a slightly different pronunciation. So if we look at this genealogy, now this genealogy focuses on the lineage that goes from Abraham to his son Ismail. And then you can see, if you go down further, you can see the Quraysh. And this is important to know. This was the group, the ancestral group that Muhammad belonged to. And at first, these are also going to be some of the same group that are against him when he begins preaching his doctrines, although some, like his uncle within the same family, will embrace his teachings, but others will not. But he comes from this particular bloodline, so that's an important word to know. And another important word to know is Hashem. What does it mean to be a Hashemite? What is a Hashemite? Like, for instance, in Jordan, the King Abdallah, and before him, King Hussein, were Hashemite kings. Well, this means that they were in a particular lineage, and this is also the mark of, say, in their nobility when the English installed kings or the British installed kingships in Jordan out in the period of decolonization. And so Hashemites today are important because they're considered to be particularly privileged, noble blood in the blood descent of the prophet Abraham through Ishmael. So this is a term to be familiar with. Now, Muhammad comes from this Hashemite lineage, as you can see there on the genealogy as it's presented. So Muhammad comes from this Hashemite lineage as well. Okay, we're going to just go through and read about we'll look at some of the key incidents, particularly from Ibn Ishaq's life of the Apostle of God, to understand who Muhammad was, what his childhood was like, and how he rose to prominence. So here's from Ibn Ishaq. It is alleged in popular stories, and only God knows the truth, that Amina, daughter of Wahab, mother of God's apostle, used to say when she was pregnant with God's apostle that a voice said to her, "You are pregnant with the Lord of this people, and when he is born, say, I put him in the care of the one away from the evil of every envier. Then call him Muhammad." As she was pregnant with him, she saw a light come forth from her, by which she could see the castles of Basra in Syria. Shortly afterwards, Abdallah, the apostle's father, died while his mother was still pregnant. Okay, again, this is from Ibn Ishaq's life of the Apostle of God, and what tells us some important facts here. First, his father died before he was born. And also you get this it's not unlike the story, the Hail Mary story of, being told that he wasn't born of a virgin. That's not what is being said here. Although, remember again, the Islamic tradition, Jesus is said to be born of a virgin. Muhammad was not born of a virgin, but it was his birth in this account was attended by extraordinary events and prophecies. This story of a light that shines from the castles of Busra. You'll hear this story repeated often. Now here is another incident from the life of the Apostle of God by Ibn Ishaq. Thwar ibn Yasid told me that some of the Apostle's companions asked him to tell them about himself. And Muhammad said, "I am what Abraham my father prayed for, and the good news of my brother Jesus. I was suckled among the Banu Sa'd ibn Bakr, and while I was with a foster brother of mine behind our tents shepherding the lambs, 2 men in white raiment came to me with a gold basin full of snow. Then they seized me and opened my belly, extracted my heart and split it. Then they extracted a black drop from it and threw it away. Then they washed my heart and my belly with the snow until they had thoroughly cleaned them. Then one said to the other, weigh him against 10 of his people. They did, and I outweighed them. Then they weighed me against 100, and then 1,000, and I outweighed them. So this is an interesting legend or account that when he was a child, these two men in white raiment that apparently is described almost in similar to being angels came to him, and they took out his heart and they found a small black drop, threw it away, washed his heart, put it back in his chest. Now note again, in the Islamic tradition, the Islamic tradition is very clear. Muhammad said over and over again, he was not making any claim to be an incarnate deity. And in fact, remember, Islam historically comes into the world effectively as a rebuke to this doctrine of incarnation. And so Muhammad is not a god like Jesus, and so there's no claim here in this tradition that he was a perfect man. But you can see here he had this black drop in his heart. But at the same time, in the Muslim tradition, Muhammad is viewed as the best of all men and the model for all behavior. So, for instance, as Sharia law develops, you have, the law being based on the Quran, which is believed to be the actual, word of God, and its spoken utterance is the representation of it. And remember, again, the word Quran itself means, oral utterance, or it's a spoken word. But Muhammad, the Sharia is also based upon the hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and it's one makes a distinction between the hadith and the Quran being the word of God, hadith being the word of man, but it is the word of the best of all men. And so while one values the word of the Quran at an even higher level, one holds the hadith in very high esteem, and this includes even the actions of the Prophet Muhammad. So he becomes a model for all human behavior, but without the claim that he is an incarnate deity. He is only a man in the Islamic tradition. That's an important distinction. We don't want to make the mistake that many Christians throughout history have made by imagining that Muhammad claims is making a messianic claim, or claim that he is an incarnation of the divine. That he says very vehemently that's not what he is, and he also says Jesus never, or the prophet Isa in this tradition never said that that's what he was either. So it's important to bear that distinction in mind. Now, one of the early and most important legends is the legend of Bahira. This is a story that's told that when Muhammad was traveling in Syria with his uncle, they came across a Christian monk who foretold that Muhammad was indeed a special child. Now, you get a very similar story in the Christian tradition when Jesus goes to the temple as a child, and he's there, disputing with the rabbis at a very young age. And so Muhammad, in this account, his talents were recognized when he was quite young. Now, here's this story of the Syrian monk from the life of the Apostle of God. When Bahira saw the boy Muhammad, he stared at him closely, looking at his body and finding traces of his description in the Christian books. Bahira looked at Muhammad's back and saw the seal of prophethood between his shoulders in the very place described in his book. When he finished, he said to his uncle, Abu Talib, take your nephew, this is the uncle of Muhammad, take your nephew back to his country and guard him carefully against the Jews. For by God, if they see him and know about him what I know, they will do him evil. A great future lies before this nephew of yours. So take him home quickly. So it's very interesting that here we have a Christian monk who identifies in Muhammad a great future. And we're going to see also there are other instances, other accounts in which Christians and Muslims enter into close and friendly relations as well. Like, for instance, when the companions of the Prophet Muhammad go to Ethiopia and see the king there who was a Christian, the Negus. And so there are different surahs in the Quran, that some of which speak favorably about the so-called peoples of the book and the importance of understanding that that they are fellow believers. And there are other surahs that emerged in the time when Muhammad entered into conflict, say, for instance, with the Jews living in Medina, that imply that the importance of living separately. And so in both cases, you find support for either worldview. And you have to remember that there's no ecclesiastical hierarchy in Islam, like as we find in the Catholic tradition. That this is also something that is rebuked in the Islamic tradition, and so consequently, each individual can interpret the Quran according to how he or she sees it. Now, of course, one relies on the authority of experts, but finally, you often hear, like, for instance, when I was living in Jordan, I often heard it said, it's between you and your God. And finally, it comes down, like, however you interpret the Quran, you will be made to you'll be held accountable for your interpretation of the Quran on the day of judgment. But there's no, like, for instance, like compared to, say, the doctrine of papal infallibility in the Catholic tradition, there's no pope that determines what is the absolute correct reading of the Quran. Now, you do have, say, in the Shiite tradition, you do have ayatollahs, and there are a number of different ayatollahs, but an ayatollah is considered to be an expert, who's steeped in the subtleties of Quranic hermeneutics. And yet, when one goes to such figures for a judgment or a fatwa, for instance, it's an opinion. Finally, in the final analysis, it is a judgment, but it's a judgment that is an opinion, and that's very different from, say, the doctrine of papal infallibility, say, in the Catholic tradition. So now, in the Quran and in other places in Islamic scripture, we get references to this notion that both the Torah and the Gospels foretold the coming of the Prophet Muhammad, but the Jews and Christians altered the scripture or misunderstood the prophecies that were told, and didn't want to acknowledge the fact that like, for instance, that Jesus or Isa foretold the coming of the Prophet Muhammad. So, for instance, let's read in the Quran. Here we find a surah: those who follow the messenger, the unlettered prophet, described in the Torah and the Gospel, are those who will attain their goal. So we have this notion that first of all, he's unlettered, which is to say, it's important to remember Muhammad was not literate in the Islamic tradition, that he received these messages or these revelations, these surahs, on a number of different occasions. Also, there's sort of this tradition that he received them all at once, and then he received them separately on a number of occasions over the duration of his career. But when he received the revelation, which then becomes known as the surah, then it was written down by a man named Salman the Persian, who wrote it down. He himself was said to be not literate, but not literate. But here we find the Quran suggesting that he himself, Muhammad, was described in both the Jewish, scriptures, the Torah, and the Christian scriptures, the Gospel. And here's another surah. And when Jesus, son of Mary, said, "O children of Israel, I am sent to you by God to confirm the Torah sent before me, and to give you good tidings of an apostle who will come after me, whose name is Ahmed." That's another way of saying Muhammad, another version of the same name, which means the praised one. "Yet when he has come to them with clear proofs, they say, this is only magic." So they reject this notion that that his coming was foretold, the Christians and the Jews. Now, here is from a text called The Unveiler. It is related that the disciples of Jesus asked, "O Spirit of God, will there be another religious community after us?" And that Jesus then said, "Yes, the community of Ahmad, which would be, again, Muhammad. It will comprise people who are wise, knowing, devout, and pious, as if they were all prophets and religious knowledge. They will be content with modest sustenance from God, and he will be pleased with a modest conduct on his part. So again, here's another one of these traditions that Jesus told his apostles that Muhammad would be coming after him. Again, remember, Muhammad comes some 600 years after the time of Jesus' birth. And here is from Al-Biruni's Traces of the Past. There are many passages in the book of Isaiah predicting Muhammad, being rather hints than explicit texts, but easily admitting of a clear interpretation. And despite all this, the Jews' obstinacy in clinging to their error induces them to devise and maintain things which are not acknowledged by men in general. So again, we have the same notion. Book of Isaiah predicts the coming of Muhammad, but the Jews are not willing to acknowledge this. And similarly, there's often the claim that changes were made to the text. And like for instance, I gave you the example in a previous lecture of the story of Lot and his daughters that are told in the after Sodom, and in the book of Genesis, after Sodom is destroyed, Lot goes up into a cave, and he's said in the biblical text to have relations with his daughters who give him wine to drink. So he doesn't know what he's doing, but then he fornicates with them, and they have two children, Ben-Ami and Moab. Ben-Ami becomes the father of the Ammonites, and Moab becomes the father of the Moabites. Well, this is one view on this that, for instance, that I heard in Jordan, was that this was one of these stories that were at which there was a change made to the scripture in order to suggest that the Moabites and the Ammonites had a impure genealogy, which then showed that they had a less of a valid claim to the promised land than the Israelites. So these are, my point here is that from a Muslim perspective, while the Torah and the Gospels both are said to be divinely revealed scripture, they're not reliable. But the Quran, by contrast, is said to be perfectly preserved and perfectly reliable. So while one says, they're valid revelations, one looks at them with some indifference because one can't completely put one's trust in them. That's basically the idea. Now, here's what the Jewish theologian Maimonides said. He said, and we've been talking about Maimonides throughout these lectures. In your letter written to fellow Jews in Yemen, you mentioned that the Muslim emissary, and this was apparently a Jewish apostate to Islam, who Maimonides is rebuking, has incited a number of people to believe that several verses in Scripture allude to the madman, he means Muhammad, such as the promise to Ishmael, I will make him a great nation. These arguments have been rehashed so often that they have become nauseating. It is not enough to declare that they are altogether feeble. More, to cite these verses as proofs is ridiculous and absurd in the extreme. Their purpose in citing these verses is to win favor in the eyes of the Gentiles by demonstrating that they believe the statement in the Quran that Muhammad was mentioned in the Torah. But the Muslims themselves put no faith in their arguments. They neither accept nor cite them because they are so manifestly fallacious. Inasmuch as the Muslims could not find a single proof in the entire Bible, nor any reference, nor even a possible allusion to their prophet which they could utilize, they were compelled to accuse us, saying, you have altered the text of the Torah and expunged it from every trace of the name of Muhammad. So this is Maimonides. So then the Jewish view is there was absolutely no evidence that the biblical text spoke of Muhammad. And so the claim then is made that the Torah was changed. But remember, from the Judaic perspective, the Torah was not changed, and this is simply false. So again, very, very different view from the Muslim view and from the Christian view as well, which would be more akin to the Jewish view. Now, again, remember, and this is from the Islamic perspective, there are three revealed traditions. They're all considered to be peoples of the book. And one thinks of, so for instance, when we were talking about the Gospel of John, we said that in the Gospel of John, Jesus is presented as the Logos, which is, again, akin to this Platonic idea of the transcendental ideal word, the word inscribed on the soul, the word in heaven, which is, from the Christian tradition, Jesus, who is the word and is co-eternal with God, uncreated, and part of the Godhead, in effect. Now, in the Islamic tradition, by contrast, there is an essential word, an ideal word, a metaphysical word, but it's or a logos, in effect, but it's construed as a heavenly book, of which there were three separate revelations. And so the Torah was a legitimate revelation. It was revealed in Hebrew. The Gospels, a legitimate revelation, which was revealed in Greek. The Quran, a legitimate revelation, which was revealed in Arabic. But these are all, as the Quran, again, remember, it means spoken word. The written Quran is called the Musaf, which is the written text. And so the Quran is said to be a copy of the heavenly book, and the Musaf a copy of the Quran, copy of a copy, in effect. So we have that kind of phonologocentric structure at work in the Islamic tradition as well. But again, since the Torah and the Gospels are said to be unreliable, the Quran, by contrast, is said to be perfectly preserved. One looks to the Quran as a representation of the divine. So think of this, for instance, when you go into a Christian church, what do you see? You see, like I say, Catholic church. You see an image of Jesus, because Jesus is said to be a representation or a representation of the Father who is in heaven. When you go into a mosque, however, you're going to see surahs from the Quran, because the Quran is also said to be a representation of the word that is in heaven. So it's a similar notion, but God is identified, let's say, in a metaphorical sense. If we're studying these texts as literature, in the Christian tradition, God is identified with Jesus. In the Islamic tradition, then this word God would be identified with this book, of which the Quran is a copy. So if you want to know, in other words, let me say this one other way. If you want to know what God looks like in the Christian tradition, you look at Jesus, because Jesus is a representation of the divine. If you want to know what God looks like in the Islamic tradition, you look at the Quran, because it is a representation of the divine. Now, again, we want to be careful to contrast the Quran with the Hadith. So we said the Quran is the Word of God, perfectly preserved, the revealed Word of God. So the surahs in the Quran it's not Muhammad speaking. He is a vessel through whom the Word of God is given to the world, but he himself is not speaking. It is God who is speaking through him. But in the case of the Hadith, this is Muhammad himself speaking as a man, but again, as the best of all men. And so one can look to the Hadith also for guidance in terms of how one should live one's life, or how, let's say, even in a legal sense, how one should govern one's society. Now, I want to note here that very shortly after the time of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, a number of important figures, particularly Bukhari, went around and gathered the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and they went through. So they interviewed many people, and they developed what are called isnads, and the isnad is what's called a line of transmission. So they developed, in speaking with many different witnesses, they compiled as many sayings of Muhammad as they could, as well as acts of behavioral acts that he performed, and they gathered it all together. But then they also subjected these sayings of the Prophet Muhammad to a very rigorous tests, like, for instance, linguistic tests. Was it or the reliability of the person who recorded the hadith, because there were some hadith that were just simply cooked up false hadith. And so you can see, like, if we look at the top here, we can see that Bukhari collected 600,000 hadith, 600,000 sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. But after he subjected it to very rigorous analysis, he came up with only 2,762 that were deemed to be authentic or accurate, that were trustworthy, and a larger number were said to be forged. So, and today, there are some hadith that are more reliable than others, and you can, if one wants to question a hadith, it's easier to question a hadith than it is to question a surah in the Quran, because the surah in the Quran is perfectly preserved and inerrant. But in the case of the hadith, for instance, maybe you might reject the isnad, or the line of transmission of the person who claimed to have said something or heard Muhammad say something. So there's a lot of disputation and debate that goes along with this. But I would just note that these sayings of the Prophet Muhammad were subjected to very, very strict, very, very rigorous tests to validate their authenticity. Now, let's read a bit about Khadijah. Khadijah is the first Muslim. She was a woman. When I say first Muslim, that means that she was the first one to believe that in Muhammad's prophetic vocation. She was a woman who was older than him, and he married her. She was a wealthy woman of dignity. Let's read a bit about Khadijah. Khadijah was a merchant woman of dignity and wealth. She used to hire men to carry merchandise outside the country on a profit-sharing basis. For the Quraysh were a people given to commerce. Now, again, remember, this is the tribe from whom the Prophet Muhammad comes. Now, when she heard about the Prophet's truthfulness, trustworthiness, and honorable character, she sent for him and proposed that he should take her goods to Syria and trade with them. Now, Khadijah was a determined, noble, and intelligent woman. And she said to Muhammad, "O son of my uncle, I like you because of our relationship and your high reputation among your people." Then she proposed marriage. Now Khadijah at that time was the best born woman in the Quraysh, of the greatest dignity and also the richest. And so he marries this woman who's a little bit older than him and who is very dignified and quite wealthy, and whom he works with when he trades goods. Muhammad was a trader. It's interesting to note that his sort of prophetic vocation did not develop until later in his life. But what we're going to see is that when he begins to receive these divine messages, or what he believes to be divine messages, that he's afraid that he's going mad. But Khadijah comforts him, and she validates his prophetic vocation. So she's a very important figure in Islam. And then she died. But in the early period of the time of the Prophet Muhammad, when he first began receiving these surahs, she was a figure of enormous significance. So when Muhammad, the messenger of God, reached the age of 40, so no, he's not even. He waits. It's up. In the case of Jesus was his mission lasted from when he was 30 to 33. With Muhammad, it was when he was 40 when it starts for him, his prophetic vocation. In the year 610 Common Era, God sent him in compassion to mankind as a bearer of the good news and a warner to all men. The messenger set forth for Mount Hira, as was his custom, and his family was with them. Now, this is going to be, Mount Hira is important. This is going to be where he receives his revelation. And when it was the night on which God honored him with his mission and showed mercy on his servants thereby, Gabriel, this would be the angel Gabriel, brought him the command of God. He came to me, said the messenger of God, while I was asleep, and said, recite. I said, what shall I recite? Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from an embryo. Recite. Your Lord is the most beneficent, who taught by the pen, taught man what he did not know. So a lot of these surahs beget this recite. So he gets this order to recite, and then he recites. So it's like he's like a secretary who's taking divine dictation. The apostle of God, may God bless him, was terrified. Whenever he raised his head toward heaven, He saw the angel, so he returned hastily to Khadijah and conveyed this information to her. He said, "O Khadijah, by God, I never hated anything so much as idols and soothsayers, and I am afraid that I shall become a soothsayer." He doesn't want this. He doesn't want what's happening to him. He thinks he's losing his mind. "O Khadijah, I hear sounds and see light, and I fear I am mad." But Khadijah believed in him and accepted as true what he had brought from God and helped him in his work. She was the first to believe in God and his messenger and in the truth of his message. By her, God lightened the burden of his prophet. She strengthened him, lightened his burden, proclaimed his truth, and belittled men's opposition. May God Almighty have mercy on her. Well, it's often said behind every good man is a good woman, and this was certainly the case here, because it's doubtful that Muhammad could have persisted in this condition if he had not been accepted by Khadijah, who became his defender. And remember, again, she was a very rich and powerful woman as well, and so she fully embraced his prophetic vocation, and she herself becomes the first Muslim. Now, the first man who is a Muslim is then Ali, and we'll address the question of Ali shortly. Ali was the first male to believe in the apostle, to pray with him, and to believe in his divine message when he was a boy of 10. God favored him in that he was brought up in the care of the messenger before Islam began. So this is going to be very important. So Ali is going to then also later marry the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, and then have two sons, Hussein and Hassan, through Ali and Fatima. Now, Muhammad did have a son who died early, but he didn't have any male heirs, and so really Ali becomes this kin, because also Ali is also his nephew, and so he's physically a relative of the Prophet Muhammad, but he also marries Muhammad's daughter. And so in the Shiite tradition, as we're going to see, this blood lineage, again, this question of genealogical blood lineage that extends from Muhammad. Of course, Muhammad traces his through the Hashemites up to Ishmael and then Abraham and so on. But then Ali, marries Fatima and then her two sons, and this is going to become in the Shiite line of transmission very important in terms of what is the caliphate, or the imamate that passes through that tradition. We're going to see one of the main reasons for the split in the early community between Sunni and Shiite was an argument over who the leadership or the caliphate. Remember, a caliph is a trustee or a steward. Who should be the steward or the trustee of the Islamic community in the aftermath of the death of the Prophet Muhammad? Well, it passes to a man named Abu Bakr, who is the father of Muhammad's wife Aisha. But the followers of Ali believe that it should have passed to Ali, and Ali he does eventually become caliph, but not he's the fourth caliph. But this is, in the Shiite view, it should have gone from the very beginning to Ali, and so why? Because of this question of blood transmission. And so there's this debate that's going to develop very early about what's more important, piety or genealogical blood descent. And the Sunni tradition is going to go more along the lines of the righteousness of the caliph. The Shiite tradition is going to insist upon the genealogical blood heritage of the caliph, which is why the view is going to be it should have been Ali and then his sons after him. So Muhammad begins to receive some pretty strict opposition from members of his own tribe and from others in Mecca, who find that he threatens them. And the reason why he threatens them, again, remember, Mecca is a city that's a lot of its commerce and economic prosperity relies upon the coming of pilgrims, because there are many different idols who are worshipped. There are many different religions being practiced there at that time. For instance, the female deity Alat is there, the female goddess. And so, and there are other goddesses and gods as well. And so when Muhammad insists upon the oneness of God, this is not just a rebuke to, let's say, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, which from this perspective divides God into three parts and is therefore a polytheism. It is also a threat to those practicing animist forms of belief in Mecca, because Muhammad is saying there's only one God. All of these other gods are false gods. Much like Akhenaten in the Egyptian tradition. And so people began to be very angry at him for this message, and they reject very vehemently what he's saying because it threatens their economic well-being and their religious beliefs as well. So from Ibn Ishaq's Life of the Apostle of God, we read, when the messenger openly displayed Islam as God ordered him, his own people did not withdraw or turn against him until he spoke disparagingly of their gods. And this is what pushes his own tribal kin against him. When he did that, they took great offense and resolved unanimously to treat him as an enemy, except those whom God had protected by Islam from such evil. But they were a despised minority. Abu Talib, his uncle, treated the messenger kindly and protected him. Okay, but the others are going to rise up against him. The tribes are going to fall upon them, the Muslims, and beat them, try to seduce them away from their religion. So now Abu Talib is a particularly important figure because he extends to Muhammad his protection. And so other members of the tribe have to leave Muhammad alone. And so it's through the protection of Abu Talib that Muhammad escapes being, let's say, beaten, for instance. But other Muslims don't have this powerful protector. And so other Muslims are getting mistreated and threatened. And so the tensions are really rising very, very high in the local community. But his uncle stays loyal to him. And people begin to debate about who Muhammad is. The Quraysh said, he is a seer. Al-Walid said, by God, he is not, for he is not the unintelligent murmuring and rhymed speech of the seer. Well, then he's possessed, they said. No, he is not that, Al-Walid said. We have seen possessed people, and here is no choking, no spasmodic movement and whispering. Well, then he's a poet, they said. No, he's not a poet, Al-Walid said, for we know poetry in all its forms and meters. Then he is a sorcerer. No, we have seen sorcerers in their sorcery, and here is no blowing and no knots. By God, his speech is sweet. His root is a palm tree whose branches are fruitful. So a lot of interesting things going on in this passage, which we should really pause and reflect upon. First, I want to note this idea that the Quran his speech being sweet. Those who listen to the words of the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran as it's being recited find it to be very beautiful. I mean, it has a very poetic, it has a very powerful, effect on the listeners, and it causes people to weep, and it moves them in a very, very deep way. But people don't know what to make of it. Some people are deeply moved by it, but they say, well, this is just another form of poetry, and this also is something that Muhammad and the early Muslims are going to refute very strongly. The idea that this is not prophecy, that this is just a kind of a poetry, but it's not poetry, and poetry itself becomes a kind of an affront to Islam in ways that are very interesting. But he's also not he's not a figure who's possessed. He's not a sorcerer. But people just don't know what to make of it when they first hear these surahs being recited. Now, about this time, this is the first hijrah, the first immigration takes place, when the tensions begin to heat up in the early Islamic community, because the people have been living there a long time, even within his own tribe. They want him silenced. And so a delegation of Muslims goes to Ethiopia or Assyria, and they visit the Negus there. Now remember, Ethiopia is the first Christian nation, so it's a Christian nation. And they go along with, and there's also the members of the Quraysh, or those who oppose the Muslims, are also are going to go before the king, and they're going to present their cases before this Christian king, who's trying to figure out, as a kind of a mediator, to try to figure out, why are all these tensions happening? What's going on, and to see what he has to say about it. And so you get, this is an image of what happens when this meeting takes place in Ethiopia before the Ethiopian king, or the Negus. And here is let's read what takes place. This is in Abyssinia or Ethiopia. It's called the first hijra, the first immigration. When the messenger saw the affliction of his companions, and though he escaped it himself because of his standing with God and his uncle Abu Talib, he could not protect him. So he's in a position where he's protected because of his uncle, but some of his followers are not. So he says to them, if you were to go to Abyssinia, it would be better for you. For the king there will not tolerate injustice, and it is a friendly country. This was the first hijra in Islam. When the Muslims came into the royal presence, they found the king had summoned his bishops and their sacred books around him. Now, these would have been Christian books. He asked them what was the religion for which they had forsaken their people, and the Negus commanded them to read the Quran to him. So Jafar read him a passage from the surah called Mary. Now, this is, again, we looked at this in a previous lecture, a surah on the Virgin Mary in the Christian tradition. So when they read this passage, of course, the Negus is going to be quite surprised by this, because, of course, Mary and Jesus are quite important to his belief system as well, because he's a Christian. The Negus wept until his beard was wet, and the bishops wept until their scrolls were wet. And when they heard what was read to them, the Negus said, of a truth, this and what Jesus brought have come from the same place. Okay, so what Muhammad is doing and what Jesus is doing, they're both divinely inspired. You too, the Quraysh and the delegates that were sent to testify against the Muslims, you just need to go. For by God, I will never give them up. I'm not going to give these Muslims up to you. They shall not be betrayed. So he extends his protection to these Muslims. And this is a nice instance of sort of ecumenical interfaith support. And this we're going to see that there are other instances of this in Islamic history where Christians and Muslims have lived in relative harmony and peace, and Jews as well, depending in different contexts, all being recognized as peoples of the book, to put it in Islamic terms. Now, another really interesting thing to note that you'll often hear referenced when you're discussing the Islamic tradition is Muhammad's famous night journey. And this is, now, there are different interpretations of this. This is a journey that he makes, said to make in one night from Medina to Jerusalem, where he goes and visits the other prophets and then comes back. Now, in the Sufi tradition, one interprets this as a mystical journey. It's a mystical experience. There are other Muslims who will read this as quite literally as him having actually made a particular kind of journey on a particular night, riding a horse to Jerusalem, to the what is the place of the Dome of the Rock at Al-Aqsa, or the mosque in Jerusalem that's built on the Temple Mount, which is also the same place where the Temple of Solomon and Herod's temple were formerly constructed, but now is a mosque with this enormous rock inside of it. So let's read about the famous night journey from the Ibn Ishaq, the life of the Apostle of God. Burak, which is the name of his horse or his steed, was brought to the messenger, and he was mounted on it. His companion, the angel Gabriel, went with Muhammad to see the wonders between heaven and earth until he came to Jerusalem's temple. There he found Abraham and friend of God, Moses, and Jesus assembled with a company of prophets and prayed with them. The messenger acted as their leader in prayer. So he has a meeting on this place, which is the Dome of the Rock, or the side of this rock in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. And he meets Abraham, he meets Moses, he meets Jesus. An entire assembly of prophets gathers, but it's Muhammad that leads their prayers. Again, remember, Muhammad occupies a particularly important status in Islam as the seal of the prophets. So this takes place in this famous night journey. Here again is an image of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Dome of the Rock, which is in the center of Jerusalem. I might note again, Muslims don't call Jerusalem Jerusalem. They call its Islamic name is Al-Quds, which means the holy. And so it is a holy site for Muslims. It's a holy city for Muslims, and Muslims have lived there for thousands of years. Well, not hundreds, is probably more accurate. So there you see the Dome of the Rock. You see the rock itself, which is inside this mosque, also said in the Jewish tradition to be the rock where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son Isaac before a ram showed up in the thicket. So it's an entire mosque built around this great rock. All right, the tensions begin to rise, and as they rise, armed conflict develops. We can think of this as jihad. Now, remember, again, there's two kinds of jihads in Islam. As we said previously, every passage in the Quran, every surah has a esoteric and an exoteric meaning. And so there's the jihad, which is the spiritual battle to expel the infidel from within. But then there's jihad, which is the actual, let's say, empirical external battle to fight those who are threatening you. And if one's religion is threatened, one has the right to fight in the Islamic tradition. And if Muhammad had not fought at this time, it's not likely that Islam would have survived. And so they find themselves in a situation where they must take militant action because their very lives are threatened. When the Quraysh became insolent toward God and rejected his gracious purpose, accused the prophet of lying and ill-treated, and exiled those who served him, the Muslims who served him, and proclaimed his unity, believed in his prophet and held fast to his religion, he gave permission, that is, God gave permission for his messenger, Muhammad, to fight and protect himself against those who wronged them and treated them badly. Permission is granted to those to take up arms to fight because they were oppressed. God is certainly able to give help to those who were driven away from their homes for no other reason that they said, "Our Lord is God." Then God sent down to him the verse, "Fight, so there is no more persecution until God alone is worshipped." So this, again, these are surahs in the Quran. So they have to fight, but they find themselves in a position where the Muslims, that it's just too dangerous for them to continue living in Mecca, so they withdraw to Medina, where they live for a number of years. And then there's a long period of conflict between those in Mecca and those in Medina. But ultimately, the Muslims will triumph and they will come back to Mecca. But Medina thereafter really becomes sort of the city of the Prophet Muhammad, and that's where today he's buried, in Medina, not in Mecca. So you can see here on this map, it's about a 200-mile journey from Medina to Mecca. And so during this period, when the Muslims have retreated from Mecca, they're living in relative peace. But when they get to Medina, at first they're welcome, but it's a city of Jews that are living there, and they're not particularly. Muhammad at first thinks that they will welcome his message, or his teachings, but they're very skeptical and a little bit uncomfortable with how similar his teachings are to their own traditions, and they see him as a heretic. And I might note too, this is also the time at which Muhammad the Muslims, when they pray at this time, they pray facing Al-Quds, or Jerusalem, the city, the holy city. But After Muhammad gets into conflict with the Jews in Medina, there comes a point where he reverses the direction of the prayers to face Mecca instead, which is the place where, again, and this turning away from Jerusalem towards Mecca is symbolic of this return to the embracing of this original religion of Abraham by facing the altar where Ishmael and Abraham prayed, and the altar that they built. So again, this is the sense in which Islamic tradition suggests that it is not the youngest of the Abrahamic traditions, but the oldest, in fact, because it signifies a return to the worship of the prophet Abraham. So the Hijra to Medina takes place in the year 622, and it's there that they meet with Jewish opposition. Now, Ibn Ishaq writes that the Jewish rabbis of Medina showed hostility to the messenger in envy, hatred, and malice because God had chosen his messenger from the Arabs. It was the Jewish rabbis who used to annoy the prophet with questions and introduce confusion so as to confound the truth with falsity. And then we find in the Quran, this surah, even though you bring all the proof to the peoples of the book, this would be the Christians and the Jews, they will not face to the direction you turn to, nor you theirs, nor will they follow each other's direction. And if you follow their whims after all the knowledge that has reached you, then surely you will be among the transgressors. So there's, again, remember the surahs are revealed from the Islamic perspective over a period of time. And so one of the things that makes it difficult if you're not a Muslim and you're not familiar with this tradition is that you have to understand the context of the surahs to understand what they're commenting upon. And what the surah is commenting upon is this growing, hostility, this recognition that Muhammad has that he's not going, he's not going to be welcomed. His message is not going to be welcomed among the Jews, and it's this point that the separation becomes even wider between these two different communities. And in fact, there's also a period of time where this is also where linked to the idea of the hijab or the veil. We'll get into that later, but that Muslim women in the streets of Medina are being harassed. And so the wearing of the veil then is also at one point, from a historical perspective anyway, linked to this idea of Muslim women wore veils to identify them as Muslims, so as a kind of a truce that developed, so that the others who lived in Medina who were not Jew, who were not Muslim, would cease to harass the Muslim women. It was a way of identifying who they were, so they would not be harassed by non-Muslims. Now, in Tabari's commentary, he writes, the prophet at first preferred the rock of the holy house of Jerusalem. This would be again the Al-Aqsa, the Dome of the Rock, which was the prayer direction of the Jews. So they originally had faced this direction. The prophet faced it for 17 months after his arrival in Medina in hopes that the Jews would believe in him and follow him. And then God said, say to God belongs the east and the west. So this change is going to take place. Here from Marvels of the Quran, from Nisaburi, we read, the Jews face the west, which is the direction of the setting lights. The Christians face the east, which is the direction of the rising lights. But the people of the faith face the manifestation of lights, which is Mecca. And so you get a lot of imagery, iconography of Mecca as being a city of light. And this is the direction that now, so Muhammad will cease to have his followers face Al-Quds or Jerusalem, and now face Mecca when they pray. And so we have a kind of a separation between the peoples of the book develops, and even in the direction of the prayers when they pray. Now, eventually, after a number of years and conflicts, Muhammad is going to return triumphant to Mecca. This is a stamp from the Islamic Republic of Iran. You see there the Kaaba and an idol or a deity being smashed against the wall of the Kaaba. And this is what Muhammad's going to do when he returns triumphantly. The first thing he's going to do is he's going to gather up all of the other statues and animist idols and so on, pagan idols, and he's going to smash them against the wall of the Kaaba. Now remember again, the Kaaba is said to be built by Abraham and Ishmael. And also we need to remember that from the Islamic perspective, Abraham is said to have left his father's house because his father made idols, and Abraham was not comfortable with his father's idols, and so he destroyed them. And so to smash these idols is then to reenact the faith of Abraham as well. Now, I would note that very strict interpretations of this, let's say from the Salafist Wahhabi traditions today, the Wahhabi version of Islam emerged in the 19th century in Saudi Arabia, but it tends to be very iconoclastic in a way of sort of replicating the iconoclasticism of this gesture of smashing the idol statues against the wall of the Kaaba. The triumphant return to Mecca occurs in the year 630. The messenger had instructed his commanders when they entered Mecca only to fight those who resisted them, except for a small number who were to be killed even if they were found beneath the curtains of the Kaaba itself. So Muhammad wants to show clemency and mercy, but there are a few who had done particularly heinous things, and their resistance had been very brutal. And so some are not going to be spared, but he largely spared those as long as they submitted. And again, remember, Islam, again, it means peace, but it means peace through submission. So as long as people are willing to submit and to worship the one God, which is the God of Muhammad. Remember, Islam begins with this profession of faith: there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Those who will submit to the worship of one God will be granted clemency. The messenger, after arriving in Mecca, once the population had settled down, went to the shrine and went around it 7 times on his camel, touching the black stone with a stick, which he held in his hand. This done, he took the keys of the Kaaba, and when the door was opened for him, he went in. There he found a dove made of wood. He broke it in his hands and threw it away. So he's breaking this dove, this idol. And when the messenger had prayed the noon prayer on the day of the conquest, he ordered that all of the idols which were around the Kaaba should be collected and burned with fire and broken up. The Quraysh had put pictures in the Kaaba, including two of Jesus, son of Mary, and of Mary, on both of whom be peace. The messenger ordered that the pictures be erased, except those of Jesus and Mary. The messenger stood at the door of the Kaaba and said, "There is no God but God alone. He has no associates. He has made good his promise and helped his servant. He alone has put to flight the Confederates. Every claim of privilege or blood or property are abolished by me, except the custody of the shrine and the watering of the pilgrims." So a lot of important information there. Note again that the particularly strict or draconian interpretations of Islam follow the second commandment very zealously and insist that there be no images. This is different in the Shiite tradition. The Shiite tradition does permit images. In some cases, the Sufi tradition, like let's say the Muridiyya in Senegal. But he does here, we're told by Ibn Ishaq, that he does preserve images of Jesus and Mary. It has all the other ones destroyed. But there has been a kind of a malaise with images. This is also why, for instance, when a few years back, when a Dutch cartoonist drew a contemptuous cartoon of Muhammad, or this also happened in France, this was seen as an affront by many Muslims. So that's also why we don't see pictures of Muhammad at all in the way that we see pictures often of Jesus. Jews and Christians in Islam. Okay, so according to Ibn Ishaq, it says, a Jew or a Christian who becomes a sincere Muslim of his own accord and obeys the religion of Islam is a believer with the same rights and same obligations. If one of them holds fast to his own religion, he is not to be turned from it. Every adult, non-Muslim, male or female, bond or free, must pay a gold dinar or its equivalent in clothes. He who does this has the guarantee of God and his apostle. He who withholds it is the enemy of God and his messenger and all believers. So note here, this what's called the jizra, or the tax. that Christians and Jews are allowed, as long as they obey, as long as they follow the laws, and they can continue to practice their own religions, but they have to pay a tax. I mean, the idea is kind of like this. It's like, because the scriptures that they received are not particularly reliable. It's, Jews and Christians, they can experience salvation, but it's harder for them because they have I've heard it said, for instance, that everybody's born a Muslim. Their parents make them either a Jew or a Christian, but there is a recognition that even though it's harder for them because they have scriptural traditions that aren't reliable, nonetheless they are recognized as authentic believers and allowed to live within an Islamic political hegemony so long as they pay the tax. Now, note here, this is an image of Spain during the Caliphate period when Spain was Islamic. And Spain was Islamic for about 900 years. And so that's important when we think of Spain today as a European Christian Catholic country. But it's very important to note that up until about the time of Christopher Columbus, Spain was, in fact, a Muslim country, and there Christians, Muslims, and Jews all lived together. Now, when Spain goes to the Catholics, this is the beginning of the Inquisition, which is a way of sort of finding out who are the remaining Jews and Muslims, those who didn't leave, and many did. Some went into, some of the Jews, for instance, some went into Germany, some went to Holland, some went to Africa. Same with the Muslim population. Many migrated to the Maghreb. And in Spain itself, a lot of the cathedrals, a lot of the mosques were converted into cathedrals. Here you see one instance of this of Cordoba that has, was a mosque that was turned into a cathedral. So there's this long, history, and that's important to know because it most very strongly impacts what the history of Spain and what Spain is today, given this more ancient Islamic substrata. Now, I'm going to read you from Ibn Abdun's on the implementation of the law. And I'm going to read you a passage from this. I don't want to imply that this was the situation of all Muslims and Jews under Islamic rule, but I do want to read it as an example of how it was not, one was not, in many cases, one did not experience full equality with Muslims, as this textual citation gives evidence for. So here were some mandates at this time. A Muslim may not massage a Jew or a Christian or empty their garbage or clean their latrines, for Jews or Christians are fitter for such work. Muslim women must be forbidden to enter the infamous churches, for the priests are profligates, adulterers, and sodomites. The priests should be ordered to marry, as is done in Eastern lands. Jews must not butcher an animal for Muslims, and the Jews should be ordered to set aside butcher shops for themselves. It would be best to allow no Jewish or Christian doctor to treat any Muslim, for they do not have true friendships with Muslims and should treat people of their own community. Since they do not have sincere friendship for Muslims, how shall one trust them with his life? So we see there that it's not, there's a kind of it's an uneasy relation sometimes. And so while they live together, there are differences, distinctions that are being made here. And it wasn't always a paradise just for Jews or Christians within Islam. In the same way, the comparison that one could make would be how it was a very difficult situation for Jews living within Christian hegemonic political rule in Europe, say, for instance, as illustrated in Shakespeare's famous play, The Merchant of Venice, where you have, this depiction of this Jewish man named Shylock, who was a moneylender. And so Jews within Christianity did not enjoy perfect autonomy either, but so too is the case of Christians and Jews within Islam. So they are permitted, but there is a difference that's made. There is a distinction that is made. Again, this description that I'm reading here from Ibn Abdun was not blanketly practiced all over the Islamic world, but it is an instance. I'm quoting it as an instance of how differences sometimes were made between these different groups. So, okay, in 632, the Prophet Muhammad dies in June of 632. And then from Ibn Ishaq, we read, giving thanks and praise to God, Abu Bakr, this is the father of Aisha, the Prophet Muhammad's wife, and the first caliph, said, O men, if anyone worships Muhammad, Muhammad is dead. If anyone worships God, God is alive, immortal. Then he received this verse, Muhammad is nothing but an apostle. Apostles have passed away before him. Can it be that if he were to die or be killed, you would turn back on your heels? He who turns back does no harm to God, and God will reward the grateful. By God, it was as if the people did not know that this verse had not come down until Abu Bakr recited it that day. The people took it from him, and it was constantly on their tongues. So this is a key passage. Abu Bakr announces the death of the Prophet Muhammad, but he reminds the Muslims that Muhammad never claimed that he was an incarnate deity. He's just a man. He died. All men die, but God continues to live. And so this is the point that he's making. And this is, again, a very important distinction and difference between the Christian tradition. For instance, we think in the Christian tradition, Jesus dies, but he's then resurrected from the dead, and then he ascends into heaven. Muhammad dies. He's just a man. He doesn't ascend into heaven. He's not seated at the right hand of the Father. He is not the Logos. He's just a prophet. Now, here's an early Christian view on Muhammad and Islam. So as it emerges, there are different views that develop among Jews and Christians. And as you might imagine, they're not always particularly positive. There is still the prevailing deceptive superstition of the Ishmaelites, the forerunner of the Antichrist. See, there you have it. It takes its origin from Ishmael, who was born to Abraham from Hagar, and that is why they call them Hagarenes and Ishmaelites. They also call them Saracens, allegedly for having been sent away by Sarah empty. So this idea of the word, if you ever this word Saracen, it's linked to this figure, to Sarah, the wife of Abraham, but interestingly enough, it becomes associated with the followers of Muhammad. For Hagar said to the angel, Sarah has sent me away empty. These then were idolaters, and they venerated the morning star and Aphrodite. These were the Arabs living in what is today Saudi Arabia, until a false prophet appeared among them named Muhammad, who, having been casually exposed to the Old and the New Testament and supposedly encountered an Arian monk, formed a heresy of his own. And after, by pretense, he managed to make the people think of him as a God-fearing fellow, he spread rumors that a scripture was brought down to him from heaven. Thus, having drafted some pronouncements in his book, worthy only of laughter, he handed it down to them in order that they might comply with it. They call us associates because they say we introduced besides God an associate to him by saying that Christ is the Son of God. They also defame us as idolaters because we venerate the cross, which they despise. And we respond to them, how is it that you rub yourselves against a stone by your Kaaba, and you express your adoration for the stone by kissing it? So here you see, again, this kind of divisions begin to develop between the so-called peoples of the book. Muhammad is rejected as a fraud and as a false prophet by John of Damascus here in this passage. He notes that they're calling us, because we have the doctrine of the Trinity and we venerate the cross, they're calling us idolaters and polytheists because we associate Christ with God. And then he flips it around and he says, well, we have the cross, but you have your black stone. And this was also an imputation that was popular in the early days of the origin of Islam by those who didn't like it. Is that it said that Muslims they worshipped stone, as did the Nabateans before them were worshippers of rocks or stones, and they're worshiping the stone in the Kaaba. But again, what a Muslim would say is that the Kaaba itself is merely a symbol. But Christians like Aquinas will similarly say that the cross is a symbol, not a fetish. Now here's a Muslim view by contrast of Muhammad. Muhammad was the most favored of all creatures, the noblest of the messengers, the prophet of mercy, the leader of the convinced believers, who, on the day of judgment, will bear the standard of praise. He is the best of prophets, and his community is the best of communities. His companions are, after the prophets, the choicest of mankind, and his is the noblest of sex. He performed astonishing miracles, possessed great natural abilities, had a sound and powerful intelligence, a most distinguished genealogy and perfect beauty. His generosity was boundless, his bravery unchallengeable. He was the most eloquent of men, perfect in every respect. So again, there you see high praise indeed, and you even see Muhammad being attributed with the power to perform miracles, which is not generally said, but he's certainly held in very high esteem, and that's characteristic of how Muslims they look to Muhammad as this model of human behavior, the best again of all men. Okay, after Muhammad dies in 632, the caliphate develops, and we said previously that this is going to become a source of division among Sunni and Shiite. But let's read this surah from the Quran. Remember when the Lord said to the angels, I have to place a deputy on the earth. This would be the caliph, would be like a deputy. They said, will you place one there who would create disorder and shed blood while we intone your litanies and sanctify your name? And God said, I know what you do not know. Now, again, in this case, the deputy, this is in reference to Adam, who is, in this sense, the first caliph or the first trustee, first deputy, first steward on earth. And this was then, again, this followed by the story of Iblis, Satan, who refuses to serve Adam. But then we have this other idea that, well, now Muhammad's gone, but there cannot be anarchy. There needs to be some kind of order. And so a caliph or a trustee, the idea of this caliph or trustee who is, here after in the aftermath of the prophet's death emerges. But a caliph is, I want to make really clear here, the caliph is not the same thing as a pope. He's a trustee or a leader, but he's not like a pope. And we said to him, O David, we have made you a trustee on the earth. So judge between men equitably and do not follow your lusts, lest it should lead you astray from the way of God. Abu Bakr said, now here is what, okay, so basically what happens is Muhammad dies and the Muslims come together. And this is said to provide evidence of the democratic nature of Islam as well, because there is a discussion that takes place, a vote in effect, and Abu Bakr is elected to be the caliph. Again, the followers of Ali are not going to like this, but this is how it develops. Abu Bakr said, here is Umar, and here is Abu Ubaidah. Swear allegiance to whichever of them you choose. And the two of them said, no, by God, we shall not accept this authority above you, for you are the worthiest of the immigrants and the second of the two who were in the cave. And the deputy, or the immigrants, as in the people who left Mecca with him, and the second of two who were in the cave when the surahs were revealed. And the deputy, or the Khalifa of the Prophet of God in prayer, and prayer is the noblest part of the religion of the Muslims. And they came to him, Abu Bakr, and swore allegiance to him. This is from Tabari. Now, so Abu Bakr becomes the first of the caliphs after the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And here you can see in this chart, you can see who the caliphs were. Muhammad dies in 632. And from the Sunni perspective, it goes from Abu Bakr to Umar. Abu Bakr was there for 2 years. Umar is there for 10 years. Uthman from 644 to 656. And they were assassinated. But then it goes to Ali in 656 to 661. And he also is assassinated. Well, from the Shiite perspective, it goes straight from Muhammad to Ali to Hassan to Hussein. These are, again, this is a genealogical blood lineage from the Shiite tradition. In the Sunni tradition, there is a succession of caliphs, but it's not a blood succession. And so there you see this division that develops very early within Islam. But historically, and there were battles that took place not long after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. For instance, his favorite wife, Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr, led the Muslims into battle against Ali in a terrible civil war. So there's always been this possibility of fissuring within the Islamic tradition, which is why but generally one has lived in peace, but it's why it's not a good idea to kind of foster these divisions. It's much better that people live peacefully. But much of the conflict that takes place in the Middle East can be determined along these theological fault lines. For instance, if we take the case of modern day Syria today, the conflict that's been going on there, it's effectively a kind of a theater of war for the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia, who have sent military and financial support to Sunnis in Syria, and the Shia in Iran, who have sent money and military support to the Alawites, who are at least nominally Shia in Syria. And so it's not Iran directly in a war with Saudi Arabia, but they are fighting indirectly in a kind of a theater of war in Syria. And so you can, if you understand how this works, again, I don't want to suggest who's right, who's wrong, or what the cause of any of these conflicts are. That's for you to figure out for yourself. But you can understand what's taking place if you understand the theological belief systems that undergird, and the history that undergirds these conflicts, or that is behind them. And then you can also better predict what might happen in the future. So let's read about the difference between what a caliph and an imam is. The caliphate substitutes for the lawgiver, that is Muhammad, inasmuch as it serves like him to preserve the religion and to exercise political leadership of the world. The institution is called the caliphate or the imamate. The person in charge is called caliph or imam. The name imam is derived from the comparison with the leader of prayer, who is called an imam, since he is followed and taken as the model like the prayer leader. The name caliph is given to the leader because he represents the prophet in Islam. At the death of the prophet, the men around him proceed to render the oath of allegiance to Abu Bakr and to entrust him with the supervision of their affairs. And so it was with subsequent periods. In no period were the people left in a state of anarchy. This was so by general consensus, which proves that the position of the imam is a necessary one. And this is from the Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun, who was a very prominent analyst. Some people say the first sociologist, when he's commenting upon how the institution of the caliphate began. Now we also read in Bahira that Bukhari and Muslim. This would be the hadith from Abu Hurairah, as the messenger of God, may God's blessings of peace be upon him, said, "Whoever obeys me obeys God, and whoever disobeys me disobeys God. Whoever obeys the commander of the faithful obeys me, and who disobeys him disobeys me." So again, as Ibn Khaldun says, there's no anarchy. Islam is a law. To live within Islam is to live within a state of lawfulness. And so there is a sense in which those who follow the mandates of the caliph, then the early caliphs, are following the prophet himself, and are being obedient to the prophet himself, and then thereby being obedient to God. So here again, you see where Sunni and Shiite live. I note, for instance, that there's a conflict right now going on between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. It's a very terrible conflict. But again, the basis of that conflict is in part because you have a large Shiite population that lives in Yemen that receives assistance from Shia in Iran. But this is something that that those who are more Sunni and the Wahhabi tradition, Saudi Arabia, don't look favorably upon. So these conflicts are very old indeed. Now let's read a little bit more about the Sunni and Shiite split here in this case. There are differing opinions regarding the appointment of the imam. Most Muslims affirm that the heir to Muhammad was Abu Bakr because the people chose him, and the Shiite maintain that the heir should have been Ali ibn Abu Talib because of the designation which came down directly from God and his messenger. Again, remember, Ali was first male who converted to Islam, and also the first was the husband of Prophet Muhammad's daughter. The Shiite differ in opinion concerning the succession to the caliphate after Ali. Some have it passed on through the descendants of Fatima, this was Muhammad's daughter, in succession. They are called Imamites with reference to their statement of knowledge of the Imam and the fact of his being appointed are an article of faith. That is their fundamental tenet. Others consider the descendants of Fatima the proper successors to the Imamite. This would be the sons of Ali, but through the selection of an imam from among the Shiite. The conditions governing the selection of that imam are that he have knowledge, be ascetic, generous, and brave. There are also Shiite sects that are called extremists. They transgress the bounds of reason and the faith of Islam when they speak of the divinity of the imams. They either assume that the imam is a human being with divine qualities, or they assume that he is God in human incarnation. This is a dogma of incarnation that agrees with the Christian tenets regarding Jesus. This is again from the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun. Now, so this is really interesting. That's something you should pause on here for a minute. I said previously that the Iranians, the Shiite Iranians who are Persian, have supported historically the Alawites in, say, Damascus and Syria, who are Arabs. Now, Alawites are, as I said, nominally Shiite, but even the Shiite, the difference is they are like what's being called here extremists from this perspective, because they raise, in the case of, say, the Alawites, they look at Ali, the nephew of the Prophet Muhammad, is literally an incarnation of the divine. And so we could say for the Alawites, Ali is like Jesus. He is a God man. He is an incarnation of God, and this is not acceptable for most Shiite. But nonetheless, because the Alawites are closer to the Shiite than they are to the Sunni, who regard the Alawites as just terrible heretics, that thereby the Shiites support them. And so I just want to bear this in mind. Like, one looks at the Islamic world and says, "Oh, they're all Muslims, they're all the same." Well, that's not the case. You can't look at this monolithically. There's a lot of diversity, and if we take, for instance, the case, there are some, let's say, extreme Wahhabi interpretations of Islam that view the Shiite as being more dangerously heretical than either Christians or Muslims. I mean, Shia itself means sect. And so in that sense, you could say, well, from this perspective, Christians and Jews are also Shiite. They're all Shiite. It's just that these Shiite are particularly dangerous heretics. This would be how many of the Sunni view the Shiite, the Wahhabi Sunni anyway. Most Sunni are more moderate. But you can see how silly it is to think of them sort of as being all the same because they're Muslim. No, the differences are very significant, and they've always been very significant. Now, in the Islamic world, one of the defining features from a, let's say, a sociological perspective, one of the things that identify Muslims, particularly Muslim women, is the question of the veil or the hijab. So this is a really important doctrine to understand and to know. It's one of the, Muslims historically, like if we take in the case of the United States, many of the first Arab migrants to the United States were called Syrians because many of the people that migrated who were of Arabic origin were Christians, because there are a great many Christians who live in Syria. Muslims historically were reluctant to migrate to the United States because they wanted to live within an Islamic world. And so one of the things that's very difficult for Muslims to assimilate, let's say in the context of American culture, let's say if you're a Muslim woman, is if you wear the hijab, it marks you in a very visible, overt, obvious way as being a Muslim, and so thereby it becomes a kind of a marker of difference. But it has its own history within Islam that is far more complex than most people recognize in the West. And I would note too that you can see there on the far right that there are some very strict interpretations of the doctrine of the hijab, and there are some that are loose, like Muslims in Syria, for instance. Women will wear a looser veil, and sometimes you'll even see tufts of hair coming out from under the veil. But generally, one has a different, interpretation of the veil depending upon where one is at in the Islamic world. For instance, the Muridiya women who are Muslims in Senegal, don't wear like a Wahhabi, face covering, as is done in Saudi Arabia. So, but it's not, the veil cannot be reduced to a scrap of cloth that women wear over their heads. It has a complex theological significance. The best text I know to go to understand more about this, in fact, one of the best introductory texts to Islam I know of anywhere, is Fatima Mernissi's The Veil and the Male Elite. So if you want to learn more about this, I would recommend that you look up this book. Again, it's called The Veil and the Male Elite by the Moroccan scholar Fatima Mernissi. It's a wonderful introduction to Islam, and it also an exploration of women's issues in Islam. But I want to take just a couple of passages from this, from the Quran, that explain a little bit more about the hijab, and then we'll conclude on this note. In the Quran, we read the surah, "O ye who believe, enter not the dwellings of the Prophet for a meal without waiting for the proper time, unless permission be granted you. But if ye are invited, enter, and when your meal is ended, then disperse. Linger not for conversation. Lo, that would cause annoyance to the Prophet, and he would be embarrassed to ask you to go. But God is not embarrassed of the truth. And when ye ask of them," these would be the wives of the Prophet, "anything, ask it of them from behind a curtain. This is pure for your heart and for their hearts." Okay, this is a verse. This is Surah 53 in the Quran. And the context of this is that Muhammad was getting married, and he had other wives, and there were men that came to the celebration, and they were staying longer than was appropriate, and they were apparently being lecherous and were acting in ways that were inappropriate. And so this was the moment, the context, when this particular surah then sort of said to descend. And so the veil here, the hijab, is not it's not a head covering. It's actually a curtain that drops between the sort of divides, we might say, the social space between men and women. It's in order that the Prophet Muhammad and his family have privacy from these boorish men who don't have the good sense to leave, and it's Fatima Mernissi goes into this in some detail, and she says, well, the Prophet Muhammad was a very courteous person, a very polite person, sometimes even to the point where he could seem to be timid. And so, but most people in this context would have probably just shown these people the door. Okay, here's another important surah. "It shall be no offense for the Prophet's wives to be seen unveiled by their fathers, their sons, their brothers' sons, their sisters' sons, their women, or their slave girls. Women have fear of God. God observes all things." So we get identified then who can be seen unveiled, who cannot. People within the same family can see women unveiled, but outside the confines of the home, then it's not deemed to be appropriate. Here's another one. "Prophet, enjoin your wives, your daughters, and the wives of true believers to draw their veils close around them. That is more proper, so that they may be recognized and not molested. God is forgiving and merciful." So again, this is in the context I mentioned previously, when men in the streets of Medina were harassing the Muslim women. So the veil then in this case became a way of identifying who was protected, who should not be attacked, who should be left alone. So it became a way of gaining protection too. So again, this is from Mernissi. She identifies 3 dimensions to the hijab, and she makes clear that the hijab is a key concept in Islam. It's not reducible to a mere piece of cloth over a woman's face, and she makes the point also that it's as important to Islam as are concepts like sin or the Trinity in Christianity. So what the first dimension of the veil that she identifies is the visual dimension. She says the hijab means to hide something from sight. It means to be hidden away. And then there's secondly the spatial dimension. It means to separate, to mark a border, to establish a threshold. And then thirdly, there is the ethical dimension. The hijab belongs to the realm of the forbidden. Anything that separates and protects is a hijab or a veil. When Mary gives birth to Jesus, the Quran tells us that she retires to a far-off place where she will be protected and unseen. This too is an instance of the hijab. Now, among the Sufis, the majub, the veiled, is a person who is trapped in earthly reality, unable to experiment with elevated states of consciousness. Hijab is the opposite of the kasaf, or the discovery, and is a negative, stigmatized concept. So now it's said, for instance, that a veil is cast over the Quran as well to protect it from the unbeliever. So it is indeed a very complex concept, and it is a mistake to just think of it as a piece of cloth that a woman wears on her head. And it's a quite complex question. We're here again, as with other matters related to Islam, we're just exploring these in terms of their basic concepts. But I do, particularly for those unfamiliar with them, but I do urge you to look further into this matter, and if it's interesting to you, and I particularly recommend Fatima Mernissi's. Again, it's called The Veil and the Male Elite. So that will conclude this lecture on Islam. And the next lecture, the final lecture of this series, we will look at the different doctrines in these